They're accused of taking advantage of Hurricane Harvey victims. Almost 50 gas stations all across Texas charging $3.99 and sometimes more for a gallon of gas last year. And two of those businesses right here in San Antonio. Eyewitness News reporter Andrea Martinez joins us live from one of those filling stations off I-10 on the far northwest side. And Andrea, how's the state taking action against the businesses?
Well, the Texas Attorney General announced today that these stations have been fined for the alleged activity. The shell behind me is just one of them, and I reached out to the owner. I haven't heard back from him yet. I spoke with two employees inside who say they know nothing about it, and here's what customers had to say.
If I would have known ahead of time, I probably would have gone to a different gas station. I know I would have gone to a different gas station.
Customers at this Crown Ridge Shell off I-10 right outside of 1604 are angry to hear a gas station they frequent is accused of price gouging during Hurricane Harvey. The gas station settled with the Texas Attorney General's office and will have to pay back more than $1,700 in civil restitution to refund Texans who were charged excessive prices for gas.
We need to be fair to the consumer and the community. And it's not a time to take advantage of people. It's a time to come together.
Another Exxon gas station on I-10 and Ralph Fair near Leon Springs is also accused and will have to pay $1,363. Those are just two gas stations out of the 48 in the state the AGs say also upped their prices during the disaster. Some as much as $8.99 a gallon. All of the businesses will pay civil restitutions totaling to more than $166,000.
It's just not a good situation.
In a statement, Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton said, "At the outset of Harvey, I made it clear that my office would not tolerate price gouging of Texans by anyone looking to profit from the hurricane." Paxton went on to say, "These settlements should teach the few who take advantage of their fellow residents to follow the law in the future." As part of the settlements, each gas station agreed not to price gouge in the future and to pay restitution to consumers.
The AG's office is also urging anyone who believes they have been scammed or price gouged by any Texas business to make sure to call the Attorney General's Consumer Protection Hotline, and that number is on your screen. For now, reporting live on the northwest side, Andrea Martinez, KENS 5 Eyewitness News.